In the year 2001, Tecmo took a shot at Capcom's survival horror supremacy with the release of their own photography-based take on that original Resident Evil formula, and to say the least, their initial offering was a little rough around the edges. But on top of that, it was also really ambitious and pretty unique with its heavy emphasis on Japanese folklore and ghost stories. It was a formula that I really enjoyed and I wanted to see expanded on, which is why we're here today. A second entry in what was about to be a franchise represented an opportunity for its developers to both polish their initial ideas and double down on what made them so special. So I guess it's our job to figure out whether or not that happened. I hope you're all down for a lot of slowly opening sliding doors and emaciated pale figures with black hair, because I'm Jared from Avalanche Reviews, and this is the Fatal Frame Retrospective. Starting development almost as soon as the first game hit US shores, Fatal Frame 2 was meant to offer players a more robust story to follow. According to Tecmo, a lot of people were too terrified to finish the original game, though I'd wager that was more due to difficulty than scary ghosts. If you watched my last video, you'll know the first Fatal Frame suffered from a lot of issues, most likely stemming from the development team working within a genre they had no real experience with. That being said, there was nothing in that first game that I would call unfixable. You know, with the right amount of elbow grease and a can-do attitude, a sequel could be just what the doctor ordered here, and in a lot of ways that's partly, sort of true. Aside from making a more engaging story, the guys behind this sequel also wanted to revamp some of the horror elements. If the producer is to be believed, they wanted to put forward a type of spookiness that spoke to people's inherent fears of the unknown. So instead of prefacing every scare with a long drawn-out turning around scene, they wanted to focus more on stuff like random unexplained noises or items falling from some piece of furniture. And to be honest, I think they nailed this direction. Akira Yamaoka did something very similar with the sound design of one of my favorite games of all time, Silent Hill 3, and in both cases, not being able to see what's making those footsteps or breathing sounds definitely has a positive effect on the atmosphere. And more towards that end, they gave ghosts the ability to just wander around and show up randomly, which does go a long way in making the game feel more dynamic and less formulaic. Although it would be nice if I knew about this new direction before I started the game. There were a few occasions where I'd set the controller down to go do something or take some notes, only to return halfway through a poltergeist attack. Just like the last video, I've elected to get most of my footage from the Xbox Director's Cut, which was released after the initial PS2 version and sees a few graphical additions as well as an officially supported 480p output resolution. I just wanted to pre-explain why you'll be seeing footage from this version of the game compared to the other two consoles you can play it on. Believe me, the whole port situation here is an entire can of worms, and you know I'm going to dive into that when the time comes. But until then, let's figure out exactly what this game is trying to say. Fatal Frame 2, despite trying to incorporate the new story-heavy emphasis I mentioned earlier, still lays out roughly the same premise as the first entry. This isn't necessarily your main character's story, or really her twin sisters for that matter. The two are really only important in the sense that we're experiencing the story of this place and its atrocities vicariously through them. The real focus here is on the history of this place and what has it looking like New York in the latter half of Ghostbusters 2. Speaking of which, the game starts out with our main character Mio and her identical twin sister Mayu resting by a spring in a pretty lush-looking forest. Mio comments on Mayu's obvious leg injury, and you might want to put a pin in that whole thing because it's going to come up later. After committing the sin of spending a few seconds not making direct eye contact with her, Mayu takes off running into the woods for some reason, and by the time we catch up with her, the scenery shifts to nighttime and we've stumbled on what Mayu calls
a lost village.
For some reason, they decide to go further into the literal ghost town that they've stumbled on, and in the process, they notice what looks like a woman walking around. Thinking they might be able to get some answers or potentially help from her, they give chase, and this is when the game starts pulling that good stuff that you've been expecting. While Fatal Frame 2 is certainly in no danger of not living up to the series' tradition of main characters slowly turning their head to look at ghosts that we can all see, they did a great job of including some other genuinely creepy shots as well. This first scene right here sets a nice pace, and I think it's one the game does a pretty good job at keeping up for most of its runtime. Heading further into the manor, we start coming across newspaper clippings and personal accounts that further flesh this place out. Seems like a lot of people refer to this as the Lost Village because, well, technically it's not here. According to the accepted folklore, the Lost Village just sort of appears to people as they wander the surrounding forest, and once it does, you're essentially trapped there. Which would already be pretty awful, but you throw in an entire population of spirits of the dead, and you've got yourself a fine recipe for a classic Japanese ghost story. We also find out that the woman we keep seeing came here to look for her husband, who disappeared after traveling to the area to do surveying for a dam that was being built. Well, on the plus side, she did find him, but on a less happy note, he was already driven mad by the place and proceeded to strangle her. Which leads us smack dab into discovering the camera obscura and its effects on ghosts. After taking out the star-crossed lover's ghost, Mio is shown some disconnected visions of events we can't really understand yet, and when she snaps out of it, we find that her sister Mayu is run off again. So Mio takes off after her seemingly possessed sibling, and although it may not be obvious, the game has just thrown us into one of its new gameplay elements. Okay, so you know how the first Fatal Frame operated essentially like a Resident Evil title, with lots of exploration and a creepy abandoned mansion? Well, the sequel does still do all of that stuff, but just with a few more steps involved. The best way I can put it is that the game went from a classic RE-type layout to a more Silent Hill feeling one. So instead of having a single large residence to explore and uncover, you have a kind of hub area with a few smaller interior locations inside of it. As the game's events continue, you'll be given all kinds of reasons to leave and return to these houses, mansions, and shrines. You'll almost never make it all the way through one area in a single section, but instead most of the time you'll get to a certain point, obtain what you're looking for, then make your way back to the village streets to find out the next spot you're headed. Speaking of which, we're going to need a key if we're going to follow Mayu past this point, and after exploring the village a little more, we come across a guy with white hair and some kind of a slapdash holding cell. He starts off the conversation by referring to Mio as a different name, and instead of correcting him, she carries on the entire game's events with a guy who thinks she's someone else just to avoid a socially awkward situation, which is goddamn relatable. Through talking to this guy, we find out he's nervous about a ritual that's starting, and his aim is to allow us to escape before that happens. So he tells us to check out all the little deities scattered around town because the key's hidden in one of them. Once we make it past the locked gate, we're taken to the ceremony master's house, and it's here where we learn a lot about the village and its inhabitants. Through the scattered writings of a folklore expert who came to this village to document its culture, we discover these people went to the Fatal Frame 1 school of esoteric religious practices. It seems like this place also has itself a hell gate, and just like the guys from the first game, they figured out that it takes ritual sacrifice to keep it closed. We don't know the exact process just yet, but we have been able to absorb the broad strokes. To keep the Hell Gate from opening, the town designates a pair of twins to perform some kind of occult ritual that ends in them becoming crimson butterflies that watch over the village. We also figure out that this ritual, at some point, was messed up so badly that the Hell Gate was able to open, locking the village away from reality and putting it in this constant state of night where everyone has to constantly relive their gruesome deaths. After linking back up with Mayu, it's obvious she's in the grips of something. She says she's being called to complete the ritual, which, kind of makes sense. I mean, think about it. Imagine you're the one stuck in a constantly looping slaughter dimension that's locked your entire village away from the world because your twin sacrifice ritual got messed up. Now imagine a set of twins just happen to get stuck in this little time bubble with you. I'd probably be possessing one of them too. Just like the first game, most of the story is told through journals and files that you can come across while playing, and once again, I am totally cool with that. However, as a video editor, it can be kind of problematic. It's just kind of hard for me to describe all of these events to you guys when all I have as a visual reference is some still images of text. which to be fair is an issue that I imagine most people aren't gonna have. But since we're on the subject of journals and written first-hand accounts, as we make our way through the ceremony master's house, we learn about some of the specifics that led up to the current state of things. It turns out the twins that were designated to go through the previous ritual, Sai and Yae, ended up taking a liking to the folklorist who is visiting the village. And since they know he's probably going to be thrown into the ceremony too, meeting some kind of nasty fate, they try to help him escape. So far, this is all the info we've been able to find, but the scattered pieces that we do have are starting to paint a pretty easy to understand picture. As our current two twins work their way out of the ceremony master's mansion, Mayu ends up getting locked in a room. Mio, being the only free one, heads to grab the key, which can be found in the first house we entered upon showing up to the village, but before she's able to leave, Mayu begs her not to, referring to a promise that they made each other when they were young. Then we get a flashback, and I'll go ahead and admit to something that might mean either me or this story is kind of dumb. So in the flashback, we see Mio and Mayu running as kids. Mio is up ahead, and Mayu's spending way more energy calling her sister's name than actually trying to catch up to her, and in the process of doing that, Mayu ends up slipping down a slope, which is where my confusion set in. So call me crazy, but I thought the imagery here made it seem like Mayu was dead at this point, and then I jumped to the obvious conclusion that Mayu was just a ghost following Mio around, and the surviving twin was stuck in a James Sunderland-like state of either not remembering or accepting this. And at the risk of ruining that same surprise for you, no, that's not even a little bit how that went. In reality, this event just led to her current day leg injury and her extreme issues with separation anxiety. And listen, I can admit when I'm being an idiot. It's almost all the time, but I've got to assume this was a purposeful red herring or something. I mean, not only is this eerily similar to something that happened to Yae and Sae that we'll find out about later, but also Mayu, despite aging like 10 years since this fall, is still walking around with a bandage on her leg like she just hurt it last week. I really could have sworn I had this entire thing figured out, and if the writers did that on purpose, little tip of the fedora. I really appreciate the twist being that there was no twist. But getting back to the issue at hand, Mio does the rational thing and leaves to get the key to the cell, but as she does, Mayu starts talking like she's possessed again.
I really will. Wait just a minute, okay?
Dear sister, are you leaving me again?
Heading back to the Osaka house by the village's entrance, we uncover a secret basement tunnel where Mio runs into these really awesome looking blind ghosts. And listen, you guys know I don't go hard on the whole everything has to be realistic and believable thing, but having an incorporeal ghost drop the key that I'm looking for from his physical belt, maybe that needed a second round of brainstorming. Like, I'm fine with them being able to harm Mio, and I can suspend my disbelief enough to accept that there are ghosts running around this place, but come on, that's too video gamey. For this to have gone down, these ghosts, which presumably have been down there since the failed ritual, would have to A, be able to carry physical objects, and B, would need to have dropped that object right in front of the only person in hundreds of years who has ever needed it. Like, am I insane for just wishing they would have let them roam around near where the key is kept or something like that? Either way, we've got it now, and you guys aren't going to believe this, but Mayu's run off again, leaving us to explore yet another one of the town's dilapidated structures to find her. Working our way through yet another house, we get a nice smattering of text-driven exposition. We've already learned about the town's religious practices and the ceremony they used to seal the Hell Gate, but now we know exactly how that ceremony goes down. Kind of like the Shrine Maidens from the first game, these villagers take any twins born in the area and raise them in an environment of brainwashing, telling them they're the only ones who can save everyone in the village. And to be fair, they would need a bit of brainwashing, as we'll come to find the ritual requires the oldest twin to strangle their sibling to death. The accepted lore is that the dead twin will become a crimson butterfly, and through some process that's never really explained, those crimson butterflies keep the village safe. We also learn that the remaining twins' hair usually turns jet white after the procedure, and the way they justify this is by raising these people to think that after the ceremony, the two twins will combine and form a single body. And I assume they've been doing this for a very long time because there is no shortage of these crimson butterflies scattered around the game. As we continue to rummage through these diaries, we get a lot of non-essential but really cool world-building info, like an entire long account of two girls that underwent the ritual at a really young age. After the oldest one strangled the youngest, the surviving twin was obviously psychologically damaged, and to help her not be so depressed, her dollmaker father creates a bit of a replacement in the likeness of his late daughter. Which actually does work, but as time goes on, the doll starts to move around the house on its own, and the dad comes to the obvious conclusion that an evil spirit has inhabited it with the goal of possessing his remaining daughter, which in his defense was pretty spot on. So this guy plans on going through the hell of killing an approximation of his own daughter for a second time, but the living twin gets wind of this and kills him first. Which is dark as all hell and really not even something you need to know about. It's essentially just the backstory for a puzzle, but hot damn, what a nice bit of world-building lore. Moving on to the actual story, Mio comes across a figure that we've been seeing in these supernatural flashbacks for a while now. It seems pretty obvious that she's one of the remaining twins from the ritual, and she seems to be responsible for all the death in the village. In the process of getting the hell away from her, Mio drops the camera obscura, and we have to go through a pretty tough portion of the game without any way to defend ourselves until we slip the ghost and head back down to grab it again. From here, we find out about the white-haired guy that we talked to previously. It turns out he was the remaining twin from a previous sacrifice that for whatever reason was botched, and the reason he's locked in the cell is because he tried to help Yae and Sae. Knowing how brutal the ceremony was, he tried to get them out of it, but in the process, one of the twins fell to the same fate Mayu did, leaving her behind as the other one hightailed it out of the village. Getting back to current events though, Mio finally finds Mayu again, who seems to have her wits about her a little better than before, and the two execute an escape plan. The only issue being, neither of them are aware that they're in a survival horror game, so obviously that plan's gonna require collecting a few key items and solving a puzzle to accomplish. And you know, I have decided that this spot right here is perfect for an arbitrary spoiler warning, so if you don't want the game's ending ruined for you, go ahead and follow the timestamp on screen or skip past the chapter mark spoilers. Or, you know, don't. I mean, I can barely dress myself in the morning. I don't need to be telling you how to live your life. So Mio heads out to do a final bit of exploration to solve the last puzzle in our way, but beforehand we should probably check in on the guy that's been helping us this whole time, which ends up being a pretty depressing affair. When Yae and Sae were trying to escape, the latter faced a similar fate to Mayu, which let the villagers grab a hold of her and bring her back for the ritual, which resulted in Itsuki, the white-haired guy who tried to help them, hanging himself. Now you'd figure they might want to call this thing off because they only have half of the ingredients, but because of the previous two failed ceremonies, that being our white-haired friend and the two creepy girls with the doll, the village is kind of in dire straits. So thinking that maybe there's a bit of wiggle room in the rules, they string up Sae and hang her instead of having her twin do it, and then ironically just sort of unceremoniously throwing her lifeless body in the Hellgate pit. And it seems like instead of closing the Hellgate, this half-assed version of the ritual either released the calamity within it or corrupted the process and brought about the village's demise in some other way. Not only does this result in the village getting stuck in a time loop, but Sae's spirit just absolutely runs through everybody who's left alive there. Which explains why there's so many ghosts around. They all died during this event, and as such, they're kind of forced to relive this torment forever. I would imagine to these guys, the arrival of Mayu and Mio looked like a 1 in a million chance to break that cycle and get a redo, which is why Sae is so hell-bent on possessing Mayu and getting her back to the sacrificial altar. Mio, after collecting all the MacGuffins for the escape, returns to the tunnel but finds Mayu being taken away by the villagers, who are once again being shown to be able to grab physical objects with their ghost hands that technically don't exist. And it's here that the game gives you a bit of a choice. You can be like Yae and continue on without your sister, or you can follow Mayu. So I saved right here to see what would happen if I did both, and I've got to say Tecmo took the easy way out on this one. If you do decide to be a coward and repeat history, Sae's ghost will end up catching up with you, and when you open your eyes, you'll be right there at the intro scene, only Mayu's not there anymore, and you sort of get an unceremonious game over, which feels a little weak. If they really wanted to punch you in the gut, they'd have some sort of a prologue where Mio says that she's unable to live with the guilt of what she did and eventually ended herself. I mean, most of the people in the story so far have taken a similar route. I don't know. I think I was just expecting something a little more harsh for the game's bad ending, but as I would come to find out, this is actually one of the least traumatizing choices you can make. Speaking of which, if you decide to save Mayu, you can head to where the ritual is supposed to take place and fight your way through about 1,000,000 ghosts on your way there. When you finally make it there, Mayu starts talking about how they were born and lived together, but they would have to die separately, and Mio's like, I mean, we don't have to. We could just walk out of this place. But then for no reason that I can figure out, Mio just throws up her hands like, well, I tried, and she just starts choking her sister out.
Kill me.
After the deed gets done, the villagers throw her body in a hole, and it does end up saving the day. Mayu turns into a crimson butterfly, and Mio chases after her to the tune of a J-pop song. And you know, at first, I was really confused as to why Mio would go along with this for zero reason, but as I think about it, I guess without this act, the two would have been trapped there forever, or for the very least until some other twin couple happened to stroll by. Now, in my defense, this isn't brought up in the final cutscene. Mayu's just like, you gotta do this, and Mio, with an alarming amount of enthusiasm, is just like, say no more. Really makes you wonder if Mio wasn't already on board with this idea beforehand. Anyways, the ending seems to imply that we freed all of these dead people from their hellish existence, and we end on a shot of Mio by herself, but with the mark of a crimson butterfly on her neck, maybe signifying that Mayu actually did sort of merge with her. Once again, we seem to be left with a plot line that justifies, if not glorifies, torturing and killing young people to appease some kind of a supernatural threat. And again, I have to marvel at the cultural difference between how your average Western writer would tackle this kind of religious zealotry versus the Japanese version we have here. I mean, to be fair, I don't even need to say it out loud because most of you have probably already auto-completed that premise in your head from years of consuming Western media. We all know that the people making the sacrifices would start out looking good, but would eventually be shown to be bad guys, and then the potential sacrificees would wake up to the idea that all of this is fake. But over here on Fatal Frame, the concept is more like, yes, this is an awful and dehumanizing practice, but hey, do you want a Hellgate to open? Yeah, I didn't think so, so get busy choking your sister. And to be upfront, this is not what I would call a critique. When I wasn't actively thinking about it, the ending of this game was pretty effective, but after the fact, as I collect my thoughts for something approaching an analysis, I don't know, I can't help but smile at the culture shock.
I'm sorry. I can't keep our promise.
Well, I can definitely say that the team behind Fatal Frame 2 succeeded in their goal of making a more substantial and followable story compared to the first game. Now, personally, I didn't necessarily think that's what the series needed, but it is hard to say the team didn't accomplish that goal. One thing I can really applaud, though, is how this game doesn't have any real narrative ties to the first outside of the general setup, its theme, and a few really cool little Easter eggs. As the franchise stands with this entry, I could see it successfully continuing on as a sort of anthology, a series of stories that don't necessarily share any real content aside from the same general theme. A bunch of unconnected people having similar experiences across Japan's wealth of creepy and potentially haunted locations. I really don't remember much of the third game's plot, but it would be nice if they continue with the same general setup, although I know I'm jinxing it into not being the case just by saying it out loud. Getting back to the subject at hand though, it was nice to see the same tricks from Part 1 being used here. That first game had this setup where literally none of the story was delivered verbally through cutscenes. Mostly, you would be walking around collecting people's diaries, getting pieces of the story, sometimes out of order, and then every once in a while your main character would get these supernatural flashbacks, where she can see portions of the inciting events, but oftentimes so out of context they're not going to mean much until you figure out more of the story. And if that's something you also like, the good news is you can expect roughly the same experience here. Because there are other characters present in the game, you are going to get 400% more spoken dialogue than that first entry, but a majority of this is just conversation as opposed to exposition. Don't worry, you're still going to be getting 99.9998% of your information via text here. Now that we've seen this formula in its second, more refined iteration, I can officially confirm I'm a big fan. Not just because a true survival horror lover is going to be used to and probably enjoy sifting through written accounts of events just to get an idea of what went down, but also because it's nice to see a team really sticking with the elements that make their game so great. I mean, really, this title could have just as easily fallen victim to the modern Silent Hill cycle, a looping series of attempts to merge established franchise doctrine with completely incompatible modern amenities. And while this is an older release and thus potentially or ideally free of contemporary game design mistakes, this was approaching the height of the PS2's popularity. It was an era where it wasn't exactly unheard of to see big names in gaming getting that modernization treatment. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I really appreciate this group sticking to their guns and delivering something that stays true to the spirit of the first game instead of altering that spirit with the goal of bringing in a wider audience. In my opinion, this isn't what I would call an incredible story, but so far with these games, the emphasis isn't so much on the story itself, but instead how slowly all the details are doled out. Essentially, at the start of the game, you're hit with a solid number of questions, and the game slowly but surely rations out tiny micro-explanations every, hour and a half or so. Sometimes you'll get these details out of order, so some of the diary entries you read might sound like random world building, but after you learn some more, previous info gets recontextualized.
You two go on by yourselves.
Now, I've mentioned before how Japanese ghost stories don't really do much for me, and truth be told, I don't find much of what happened here to be engaging in and of itself. But what I did enjoy is how it felt like I was putting so much of it together on my own. And on that DIY note, by the time the credits rolled, I was able to piece most of this together, and the only thing I was really fuzzy on were all the coincidences. I mean, our twins Mio and Mayu, by sheer luck, winding up in a village where twins are turned into sacrifices is something I could probably hand-wave away, but then there's also the analogs between them and the previous village sacrifices, and it all seems a little too perfect. I'm gonna have to assume that them getting the same exact injuries and nearly the same exact scenarios plays into the whole looping thing here, kind of like these events are doomed to repeat themselves, but I don't think I can remember actually receiving an in-game explanation for this. Aside from that though, this is a perfectly workable story. It sticks in line with the first games while still bringing a little more to the table. Sure, concepts like the Calamity, Sacrifice, and Hellgate all come back, but instead of a simple retread of what worked in the past, this feels more like a Final Fantasy sequel. You know, the kind where characters and locations might change from game to game, but the same elements and themes can still be found repeating over and over again. If you do end up getting into the whole Japanese wandering spirits thing more than I do, I'm sure there's going to be more value here, but even if that's not the case, I can confirm this is still a solid tale. Let's say a good 7 out of 10 kind of material. If you watched my video on the first Fatal Frame, you would know that I really enjoyed it as an experimental offshoot of my favorite genre, but as a functional video game, it was a little too difficult. At the end of that video, instead of being mad about all that though, I was really looking forward to the team taking another shot at the formula. There were some glaring flaws that I wanted addressed for sure, but the raw materials were there for something that could potentially be so much more. So as you might imagine, my hopes were actually quite high given the fact that I came away from its predecessor with so many complaints. And outside of the tiny tweaks to its established style, in a more broad sense, I'm happy to report that Fatal Frame 2 is very much still a product of its genre. Any fan of survival horror would likely come into this one expecting a mountain of locked doors and an untold number of puzzles and exploration between them and the endgame, and that is precisely what they're gonna get. And like I've already mentioned a few times, Fatal Frame 2 is actually kind of unique in the sense that it takes place across several smaller interior areas all connected by this sort of hub town. Throughout the story, you're going to need to return to previous locations, and I'm not lying when I say I found this to be kind of fun. Now, if we look at it through a more cynical lens, it is pretty clear this was just a way for the team to keep up a relatively long 8-hour runtime, while still saving time on environment design and significantly decreasing the number of graphical assets they would need to stretch across those 8 hours. And to be sure, that is some portion of what's going on here, but I feel like it works really well for this style of game, so we're gonna go ahead and pretend that it's not. Just like Fatal Frame 1, you can choose either a traditional analog stick-based control scheme or the obviously superior tank controls. I'll give you two guesses as to which one I picked, and to the game's credit, right off the bat, your run speed seems a little less slow motion than that first game. I'd say we're still pretty far from the land speed of your average STARS member, but I'll take my wins where I can get them. Focusing back on that first entry, one of my biggest issues was that the environment felt kind of sticky to move around in. Like if I'd hit a wall at a certain angle or I brushed a little too close to a doorway, it was really easy for my character model to get hung up. In Fatal Frame 2, I'll go ahead and call that problem 100% solved. No more getting caught on tiny pieces of clutter in a room, and no more dreading the thought of going through a doorway. And for a game that has you exploring for a majority of its runtime, these small improvements to movement feel disproportionately effective. Compared to that first game, I didn't feel like I was coming across as many puzzles, but it wasn't necessarily like the game was hurting for them, it was just something I was aware of while playing. On the plus side, the talisman doors that I liked from the first game are back here, but on a more neutral point, they operate kind of differently. Normally, these would have you taking a picture of the talisman hanging from the door, which would reveal a sort of vague location for you to explore and take a picture of. When you'd find the place, you'd search around for a ghostly apparition and snap a pic of it, destroying the talisman and giving you access to whatever was beyond that door. And here, roughly the same process takes place, but only sometimes. On occasion, these things will have you taking pictures of stuff to unlock the door, but sometimes it just wants you to go to that location. It could be for a fight or because you need to get an item, but it just sort of wants you to be there, which I don't necessarily see as being either bad or good, but again, just a difference I wanted to point out. Getting back to the whole Hubtown thing, these houses tend to be a little smaller than something like the Spencer Mansion, but you get to move in and out of them pretty often, so you don't actually get much of an opportunity to get particularly bored with any one area. Oftentimes, you'll need to leave a house with a few of its doors still locked, and this always got me pumped at the idea of coming back at some point when I've collected a new key item or something. In the same way the first game would spawn in new usables with every chapter, Part 2 is going to repopulate items every time you return to one of these interior locations, which offers a nice incentive to do that even if the story isn't making you. And finally, we've gotten to the most contentious point, the combat. Just like the first game, your weapon is the camera obscura. Hitting the ready button will have you switching to a first-person view, and instead of just firing blindly at ghosts, these games really reward you taking your time. In these games, the accepted strat is keeping the target in frame for a while, getting uncomfortably close, and snapping pics just before an enemy attack is about to land. Taking the risk and the time it takes to pop off the best shot that you can get is going to reward you with higher amounts of damage, obviously, but also more points that could be spent on upgrading your camera. This game's main addition to that system are the combos. When you get a chance for a zero shot, taking it will leave the opponent open to more attacks for a very short window, giving you the opportunity to fire a series of shots at them if you can time it correctly. Essentially, while the ghost is recovering from that first hit, you can follow up with a few more. I was only ever able to get maybe 3 in a row, but that's mostly because these things knock ghosts back pretty far, and I'm not sure there's a single screen in the game that could facilitate maybe 3 or 4 hits before the thing gets knocked behind a wall or piece of the environment. Here in the second game, they slightly limited the effect that grinding can have by requiring both the right amount of points to buff a stat or lens and a special item that'll slot into that upgrade. As you might imagine, these spirit orbs are limited in quantity, and it doesn't seem like there's enough in the game to allow you to fully level every stat or lens to max, but there seems to be more than enough to improve on the ones that you're going to use the most. Now, it's important to mention that this specific combat system was one of the things that really helped the first Fatal Frame stand out from the crowd, and if you watched my video on that game, it was also where I think Tecmo dropped the ball hardest. Really, on paper, it's an awesome system. Having to keep the ghost properly framed in order to build up a charge and letting yourself get uncomfortably close to danger in order to do more damage are all really great ideas. And that's not even counting how cool the general concept of using a camera as a weapon is. In practice, however, that first FF game had some of the most frustrating combat I've ever experienced before. And to address some of the comments that I've read in my previous video, yes, it is entirely possible that my upscaling video chain has had some form of negative effect on me getting good, as it were, but just for context, I recently played through Mega Man X, X4, and 8 with this same setup. I feel like if lag was any real concern, I would have run into it far earlier than this. That being said, I'm not so knowledgeable of the processes going on inside of my upscaler that I can 100% rule it out. Regardless of the reason though, that game was a nightmare to finish. The ghosts that you would fight had this severe tendency to travel through walls where you can't see them and wind up nearly undodgeable attacks, so not only can you not interrupt them with a pain state, but you're basically guaranteed to take some form of damage. Which really hurt, because these ghosts could take away more than 50% of your life bar with a single attack, and very regularly did. In my video, I spent an insane amount of time ranting on this particular subject, and I also talked about my hopes that the team would address some of those issues with a sequel. And, well, they did and they didn't. In some scenarios, this can still be some of the most frustrating combat from a finished AAA video game that I've ever played, but I will say there have definitely been some attempts at fixing things. On the plus side, ghosts on average do far less damage per attack here, which is a godsend. On top of that, you can now find an accessory that'll show a flashing light on screen when a combo shot can be performed, and even one that'll play a noise, which makes hitting those 3 hit strings much easier and satisfying to pull off, meaning you're probably going to be doing a lot more damage to ghosts with a little less risk involved. Relating to that, you're also given way more healing items here, so completing this game was nowhere near the slog it was for part 1. In that game, I had gotten to a point where I had to save before and after every single enemy encounter, bar none. I mean, fights were just becoming so unfair, and I had almost no resources left to deal with them. Well, I'm thrilled to say that I did not have to save scum in order to beat this game, which is a massive upside. But that is not me saying that this is a significantly less annoying combat system. And you might be wondering how things are just as frustrating when I just got done talking about all of these obvious improvements. That may take a while to lay out, but one of my largest issues is that on top of defanging your enemies, they also nerfed how much damage you can do to them. I don't exactly have any concrete numbers on this, but it feels to me like most encounters you get into here in the sequel last roughly twice as long as they did in part 1. And that's not just because I'm doing less damage comparatively. See, one of the new additions here are these ghosts who can only be targeted just before they attack. And to be fair, in a sense, I applaud the idea of forcing players to engage with the zero-shot mechanics further. However, I don't feel like this was the right way of going about that. Because these ghosts can't be damaged at any other point than the moment just before one of their attacks land, you're going to want them to be attacking a lot, but instead they're essentially inert. Sure, they might make their way over to you eventually, but if you're a normal human being, that process is going to drive you insane. So to combat this, you're going to want to get in close so you can bait out an attack and get that zero shot. The only problem being, I've noticed with most ghosts, they have a single attack that they can do that has no wind-up. So you're kind of left with a dice roll. You get bored of waiting and then you walk up close to bait an attack. Then you pray to God it's one that gives you an opportunity for a critical and not one that activates instantly and damages you without any warning. Because of the lessened damage output on your end, there's a much bigger emphasis on getting zero shots, so you're going to find yourself using this strategy on ghosts that actually can be attacked normally. Because sure, you could snap a regular picture of them for a paltry amount of damage, but why would you waste your time and film on that when you can do 3 or even 4 times the damage just by waiting for them to try and attack you? And it's an even bigger tragedy because I feel like it wouldn't take much to make this thing work perfectly. Just 2 potential avenues could have this combat system absolutely killing it. Either you increase the damage done by normal shots, making zero shots a very useful critical that doesn't need to make up the bulk of your combat strategy, or you increase enemy attack frequency so people relying on zero shots can get them without spending 2 minutes walking backwards in front of a ghost that they desperately want to be able to damage. Okay, so I know I'm complaining a lot, and fair warning, I will do it some more, but I do want to let it be known I'm thankful that issues were addressed here in the sequel. Without a doubt in my mind, Fatal Frame 2's combat feels much better than its predecessors, but it seems like in fixing some of those lingering issues, they might have caused a few new ones, and that's what I'm talking about here. But outside of that continually botched zero-shot mechanic, the ghosts here can be just as annoying as they used to be, and it wasn't entirely uncommon for me to get into a fight with ghosts so cheap that it felt like the people who had developed the game had formed some kind of vendetta against me. For example, these three little shits right here. Out of sheer luck, you encounter them all together in this big open room, but the very microsecond that you turn to snap a pic of the one that's winding up an attack, another one's going to teleport behind you for a grab. And like I said before, you are given more healing items on top of enemy damage getting dialed back, which is great, but it doesn't really do much for how frustrating it is constantly taking damage that feels like you never could have avoided. In beating this game, I came across several encounters that I restarted, not because I ran out of resources or took too much damage, but because I figured there had to be some kind of pattern that I was missing. Like, there was no way the developer intended strategy was for me to eat 6 or 7 BS attacks before being able to do any damage. And with very few exceptions, after a few attempts, I would almost always discover, no, that was basically it. And I've got to shine a very special light on the few sections of the game where Mayu's with you. This girl absolutely loves getting in between you and Ghost, and she will almost 100% of the time body block you while you're in first person backing up. I mean, hell, even when you're not in combat, she has an awful habit of blocking you into corners and then acting like you just slapped her across the face when you have the gall to try and run around her. Now, to be as fair as possible to the game, this isn't something you'll have to deal with even 20% of the time, but when you do have her around, she's going to be a massive pain in your ass. And listen, I 100% get it. Survival horror is not exactly a genre built on easy gameplay. In fact, it's most often the opposite. These games love leaving you feeling like you've got no chance, artificially creating those moments where you're almost out of ammo and you defeat the big bad guy with the last few rounds to your name. But I would say that's something that needs to be done through careful resource management and enemy placement. Trying to shortcut your way there by giving the game's enemies such an unfair advantage over the player is only going to increase frustration. Ideally, I should feel like there's a resolution to every problem that doesn't require taking unnecessary damage. I might need a better plan, find an item, or flat out choose to pass some enemies by, but it needs to feel like any of the game's hurdles can be leapt with the right applications of the tools that you've been given. In Fatal Frames 1 and 2, though, in interestingly unique ways, it feels like the developers heard that survival horror games were supposed to be hard, so they went about artificially making their game hard so it could better fit in. Either that, or they never play-tested their own work, because I can count on one hand the amount of fights I got into across both games that didn't feel like I had to cheat in order to survive. Between the two available FF titles, at least as far as this retrospective goes, I would definitely go with Part 2. Because at least there, the cheapness doesn't get in the way of actually finishing the game. Fatal Frame 1's difficulty is what I would call a detriment to anyone looking to play it today, where Part 2 is more lacking in what it could be accomplishing. Certainly a big improvement and a noticeable uptick in playability over that first title, but still suffering from what I would call very fixable issues. And you know, after saying all of that, there were still definitely times in Part 2 where I was feeling the flow of things and the environment allowed me to have a fair, fun fight with these spirits. I mean, sure, I would still take the odd bullshit cheap shot, but the amount of fun I was having lining up attacks and trying to get groups in the same shot for extra damage far outweighed how minor of a frustration that could be. And keeping with the upsides, just like its predecessor, Fatal Frame 2 excels at most of the elements key to survival horror, which means it's fun as hell exploring these broken down Japanese houses, solving really challenging puzzles, and looking deep into the lore for hints on where to go next. The new village location, which mirrors Silent Hill's eponymous town in terms of mechanics, helps change things up and offers a nice coat of paint to put over the tried and true backtracking that fans of this series and this genre would be looking for. It's just when ghosts show up for a fight where things become less than ideal. So this might be a little surprising for how much I've complained in this video, but I would say once again we have ourselves a must-play for people who get into these type of games. I mean, don't get me wrong, it still falls short in some annoying ways, but it also excels at all the stuff that survival horror fans will be looking for. And it should be said that the improvements over its predecessor, while not 100% successful, are commendable. I know I'm setting myself up for failure, but damn, I really hope they're able to make the slight changes necessary in the next game in the franchise to really let these good ideas shine the way that they should. They've already shown that they're capable of doing this to some degree. I just love to see them push this thing all the way to the finish line. Like I've already said a million times before across both of these videos, these are great ideas, and I think all that's required to have them reach their full potential is for someone with some slight common sense gameplay knowledge to step in and start making very small tweaks. But you know, I'd feel bad for ending on a negative note like this, especially for a game I had so much fun with, which is why we're now officially transitioning into talking about Fatal Frame 2's ports, which is a subject that honestly is almost more interesting than the game itself.
Come on, let's get out of here.
Starting off with the PS2 original, we're looking at a bit of a downgrade from the first game. Natively, it's got a 480i image, just like Part 1, although we are using GSM here to force 480p in these captures, which is all well and good for a PS2 game. Pretty standard fare, but it's the frame rate that really has me disappointed. Part 1 operated at 60 interlaced fields per second, which if you're using a deinterlacer is effectively 60 FPS. Fatal Frame 2, on the other hand, is a 30 FPS game on every platform. It seems pretty obvious this was a sacrifice made for larger, more detailed environments, but to be totally honest, given the type of game this is, it's not exactly something you should be all that aware of most of the time. I mean, yes, it's really nice having a silky smooth 60 FPS frame rate, but not having it in a survival horror game specifically shouldn't ruin your time. But of course, that's only when it's actually hitting its target. During fights with multiple ghosts and some strange scenarios, you can see that 30 FPS get cut nearly in half, and that is never a good thing. But on the plus side, I will say that most of the time, the frame rate in this game shouldn't be a huge issue for anyone. Sure, technically a lower frame rate will mean smaller windows for things like zero shots, but because Part 2 solved the first game's issues on that front, I really don't imagine anyone's going to feel any negative effects from this. Getting back to the whole resolution thing, I've found that forcing progressive scan through GSM on a PS2 never really produces the vast differences in fidelity that you might see with similar features in the GameCube's Swiss, so we're not looking at a huge jump in that sense. As a matter of fact, taking a close look at the footage, it seems like forcing 480p might actually result in a slightly softer image, but there still is a really good reason to do it. If you're already used to having to deal with the PS2's video output combined with a video scaler, you're going to know that motion adaptive deinterlacing is the GOAT, but you'll probably also know that even that process has its visual downsides. For example, there's nothing on the market right now that can deinterlace perfectly in real time, so depending on how fast you're moving or what's happening on screen, you might be able to notice moments where combing artifacts shine through. On top of that, deinterlacing can cause a bit of a blurry image when things are in motion. It's certainly not too bad, but you will be able to notice a difference in clarity when you're standing still versus when you're moving the in-game camera around. And of course, there are a few other artifacts as well. You can see them when highlighting options from a list. On the interlace side of things, you could see a slight jump as I highlight the option, but with 480p this isn't present. Hopefully it goes without saying, but all the stuff I'm going to talk about here really isn't all that important when it comes to playing a PS2 horror game, but as a video nerd, I really enjoy getting lost in the small details. So feel free to let your eyes glaze over for the next few minutes if you're not into all that, and then just decide which one looks best to you. And I guess we should probably start off with the least important one. Just like the first game, FF2 uses a per-vertex lighting system, which means the real-time light cast by your torch will display an effect on a set number of vertices in the environment. You can actually see this taking place for yourself by paying attention to the light cone as it moves around. You could see it creating these little geometric shapes. It's a trick you can see in a lot of PS2 games, including Silent Hills 2 and 3. Compared to the first entry in the series, you can definitely tell there's been a real push towards including lots of small details here in the sequel. It's overall a much more detailed picture, but I won't lie, I kind of prefer the bigger, smoother, less defined look of the original. That game had a lot of rounded edges, simplistic shapes, and a lot less stuff in the background to look at, but I don't know, I feel like it stood out a little better visually. Which isn't to say the second game looks worse in any way, I just prefer something about the original that I can't really explain. I'll say though, one area where Part 2 definitely outshines its predecessor is in the film grain. That initial release of Fatal Frame had a static filter with these really big grains to it, and it was overall way more opaque. Here in Part 2, it's still there to a degree, but it's more transparent, and the smaller size of the individual grains makes it way less distracting, which might not mean too much to most people, but for a weirdo like me, that's really cool to see. Moving on to the Xbox port, this is the version of the game that I got most of my footage from, and that's for a lot of reasons, but most of them come from this being a director's cut of the game with a bunch of fixes and new content smashed in. First up on the list, we have a native 480p image, which you'll know is always great to look at. I mean, we were forcing it on the PS2 anyways, but it's always great to see an officially supported 480p mode. I was also stoked to see an upgrade for the flashlight in the form of per pixel lighting, which I imagine is something most people wouldn't care about enough to notice, but I guess that's what you guys have me for. For this port of the game, I chose the control option that switches around the way the thumbsticks work. In the first game, the fact that I moved my head with the left one and my body with the right just never felt good to me. And, as expected, this was a much better way to play this game. What had the polar opposite effect of that, though, is the option to map your first-person quick turn to the left analog stick's button press. Throughout the entirety of this game, I flat out could not stop myself from accidentally initiating a quick turn most of the time when I was just about to line up a zero shot. I'm being dead serious with you guys when I say that I accidentally quick turned probably once per fight, and each one was more frustrating than the last. But hey, on the plus side, at least this port lets you switch between 3 of your lenses via the Y button. Honestly, I didn't really get a lot of use out of this, but it is still nice to see the devs trying to improve on the formula. And speaking of which, Tecmo added an FPS mode to this port, and truth be told, it works pretty well. I imagine it'll get more cumbersome as you move into the smaller locations and you're going to need to look up and down more, but this offers a really nice way to experience the game a little differently after you've beaten it. Just like most PS2 to Xbox ports, you can expect a few graphical features to be sort of broken here. For example, the black and white scenes where you can see your sister being possessed, you can see these jail bars and diagonal lines in the fog. I'm not really sure what's causing the issue, but it's kind of fun to point out. And coming in second in the niche porting differences that only I care about contest, this version of Fatal Frame 2 uses much more compressed cutscenes than its PS2 original. When you see them side by side, you can tell there's a lot more block boundary artifacts over here on Xbox and these huge sections with messed up color information. To be honest, I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what would cause this since both consoles use the same DVDs for game media. And the best theory I've been able to come up with is that I don't know, maybe the first-person mode ate up a little extra space on the disc. Really, I'm not even sure that overcompressing the scant number of pre-rendered cutscenes in your game would net you the extra space to make it worth doing anyways, but I don't know, that's the best I could do. Now, like I've already said, I used this Xbox port for a majority of my captured footage, but if I'm being honest, I'm not sure there's so much of a difference here that I'd recommend you have to do the same. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a fine port of the game, but since you can technically play that PS2 original in 480p, and I didn't necessarily find the new camera functionality and FPS mode to be massive game changers, I'd say just go with whatever console you happen to own or have plugged in that day. Okay, so listen, I am more than aware that I often use this platform that I've been blessed with as a springboard for my anti-Nintendo Wii propaganda, and I'm 100% sure that one day there will be a valid reason to stop doing that. Until then, we've got the Wii port of Fatal Frame 2. Except for actually we don't, because Project Zero 2 Wii Edition is actually a remake of Fatal Frame 2 that was released nearly 10 years after the original came out. It was built from the ground up to take advantage of the Wii's, we'll go with unique control setup, and it seems to have been made in Fatal Frame Mask of the Lunar Eclipse's engine. And at the cost of giving away the reveal, playing this has given me a lot of doubts about whether or not I'm going to enjoy that game. Now, in full transparency, I've gone back and edited this script after finishing Mask of the Lunar Eclipse, and I will say that through the course of that game, I have softened on some of the problems I'm about to list. But because this is genuinely how I felt when I first experienced them, I'm gonna stick with my initial thoughts here in this video. Just know that I will eventually not hate all of this stuff quite so much. Starting off, I can confidently say that this was nowhere near a lazy remake. They rebuilt every single solitary part of the original here, including the cutscenes, and re-recorded dialogue with new voice actors. Voice actors who are all much more British than I remember them being before.
Your leg. It's not sore, is it?
Only a little. I'm okay.
And you might be wondering why that is, but if you listen to the name I read earlier, you may have noticed that I didn't use the US title of the game. And that's because this remake only came out in Europe, Australia, and of course Japan, which explains why the research phase of this video was the very first time I learned of its existence. Alright, so what does a decade's worth of game design evolution get you here? Well, at first things actually seem kind of promising. Just like the Xbox port's FPS mode, this version of Fatal Frame 2 gives you an interesting new perspective to view All God's Village through, specifically the RE4 over-the-shoulder kind of perspective. Which admittedly is something I can be kind of hostile towards thanks to previous betrayals, but to be fair, it does feel pretty good at first. Movement isn't noticeably scuffed, and the redesign of the village seems to accommodate this new camera placement well, but when you get past the first maybe 15 minutes or so, things take a nasty turn down shoddy Wii game avenue. Which is all the more disappointing because I was really stoked when I first saw that I could control the flashlight with the Wiimote. That functionality in Silent Hill Shattered Memories really made the game feel tailor-made to the platform, and it didn't feel as good when making the jump to non-motion control-based consoles. Sadly though, I can't say the same thing for this version of that system. In Project Zero 2, you have a very limited amount of control over where your flashlight shines. Mio never really lifts her arm up, so there's an upper limit to the height you can get to, and overall it's just way too tight. It felt like a lot of contortion was needed for not a lot of on-screen movement. But hey, don't worry about that too much, because for most of the game you actually can't use this mechanic. When you're running, the team made the flashlight automatically shine downwards, illuminating your path forward, and if you're not holding down the run button in Fatal Frame 2, you're probably in a menu. Honestly, if I didn't know any better, I'd say this functionality was thrown in at the last minute because it's almost never necessary. The general idea is that items aren't going to be visible unless you shine your light on them, but 99% of the items that I came across were illuminated merely by me getting close to them because they're always on the ground, and like I said, the flashlight always points down when you're running. And the worst part is, when you do come across those items, you have to deal with this. And I will admit that I get the idea behind this mechanic. I mean, this is a ghost story, so making the player reach into places they can't see too well, it feels like an obvious choice. But you gotta keep in mind that this is a survival horror game. Like 85% of what you're gonna be doing here comes in the form of grabbing items, and maybe making that process potentially long and drawn out is not a great step towards improving it. I played this remake for about 2 hours, and this whole holding the A button down for Mio to slowly grab stuff thing got old by the third time I did it. I feel like stuff like this should be relegated to minigame status at best, and it should only show up every once in a while. But when you make it the main mechanic driving all of an 8-hour game's progression, I mean, who thought that was a good idea? But hey, let's look on the bright side. I mean, this is a Wii game with motion controls. At the very least, we can count on a first-person camera mode that works really well. I mean, this is a combat system that seems custom made to work on a console like this. So imagine my genuine and honest surprise when it absolutely sucked. Now, your first thought might be that you're going to hit the aim button, putting the game into first-person mode, and then you would have control over the camera with the right Wiimote acting as a pointer for it. Maybe because that's how every other game for the console functions. Well, how it works here is your Y-axis is the only one mapped anywhere near 1-to-1 with your motion, so if you move your right hand up, the camera looks up. But the horizontal axis, because it's such a special little snowflake, is changed by spinning the Wiimote left to right in your hand, basically twisting it. And yeah, that feels about as good on your wrist as it sounds. Now, you might call me a slow learner, but utilizing real-world 1-to-1 movement to look up or down, but then a twisting motion to look left and right just never felt natural, and I can't for the life of me understand what would have inspired them to do this wacky-ass combination of movements instead of using the hardware in the most obvious and effective way. And believe me, as a guy who's played this remake, that's enough of a reason for you not to get into it. But the absolute worst part is that the motion controls are always on and they're always tracking your right Wiimote. Which means if you come across a ghost sighting and you hit the aim button real quick to snap a picture of them, unless you're one of those weirdos who always holds your controller pointing at the dead center of your screen, even while running when you effectively have no control over the flashlight, you're going to start drifting up or down when you go into first person. And depending on how close you are to the target, you're probably going to miss your shot. It's a tough issue to avoid because while you're running, there's no real indication that you're pointing your controller at the top of your TV. Now, to be totally fair, this is an issue with all Wii games that have the player hitting a dedicated aim button while carrying over positioning info from before the aim button was hit, but it really stands out as stupid here. I mean, listen, I know I talk a lot of shit, and I may or may not enjoy going into my comment section every week or so and picking a Wii fan to just piss off, but you can't honestly tell me you find it comfortable to keep your wrist locked squarely at the dead center of your TV while playing video games for hours on end. And you know, it sucks even further because this right here is one of the hardest parts of any review. I have to sit here and try my hardest to figure out a way to put a purely mechanical action into the kind of words that would make a person understand a physical experience that they've never had before. It's no easy task to say the least, especially when things control poorly because you really want to explain what you're feeling in these videos and sometimes the only words you have are shitty and severely aggravated. So if I've done a bad job with my descriptions here, man, I hope the included footage of me really and truly attempting to play this game well fills in some of the cognitive gaps because this is easily some of the worst feeling controls I've ever used before. And you know, it's not like this is purely coming from a place of negative bias. I mean, sure, it's like 50% that, but if you go back and check out my take on the aforementioned Silent Hill remake, I love the motion controls in that game. So you're gonna have to trust me when I say that this game's combat is absolute grade A uncut ass. But hey, on the more positive side of things, this remake actually looks pretty damn good. I think they went a little too far in brightening things up, but getting to see more of the awesome environments from FF2 is nice enough for that not to bother me too much at all. The brand new pre-rendered cutscenes are pretty impressive as well, although they do have this odd horizontal artifacting, which I found out from the fourth game is actually due to them being meant to be viewed in 16:9, which at the time wasn't exactly unheard of for a Wii game, but still kind of uncommon. The new over-the-shoulder perspective gives you a much better look at what's ahead of you than the original did, and this is a Wii game, so you can expect a relatively shallow draw distance here, which can be more or less obvious depending on the area you're in. And I forgot to mention it before, but this is also the case with the Xbox's FPS mode. Oh, and the frame rate in combat can fluctuate a lot, but to be fair, that's not something unique to this remake. Just like the director's cut of FF2, you can expect a native 480p image at 30 FPS here on Wii. Which, if there was ever an argument for how hard Nintendo has held back this industry, let's just keep in mind that after 10 years of technological progress, the Wii was able to achieve the exact same resolution and frame rate as an original Xbox game. Alright, so getting down to brass tacks, I would say this is a pretty awful version of Fatal Frame 2. It changes most of what made the original game so effective and replaces all of it with these dumb forced jump scare mechanics where you have to laboriously take part in the game trying to spook you. On top of that, I just could not get used to the controls, and I feel like the atmosphere was lost in the translation. I mean, listen, I can appreciate these guys not taking the easy way out and remaking the entire game from the ground up. I'm just saying I wish they would have remade it into something I enjoyed. Well, alright, now that we have effectively pissed off an unknowable chunk of the audience, we're left with a few questions. After all, this is a sequel, so it's got a few more responsibilities than just being good. I mean, sure, a good game is great, but ideally you'd want something that successfully continues the legacy of the original and adds a little more to the equation to justify you not just picking up that first game again instead. And while my thoughts on the game are a little more complex than just this, I'd say it does a really great job as a sequel. And I say that because it can be easily identified as a Fatal Frame title from miles away. It feels like a great continuation of all the innovative ideas that Tecmo squeezed into that initial survival horror offering, but with a few improvements on what I felt was a pretty flawed first showing. It made leaps and bounds of progress on the game's combat, although I'll admit I still haven't seen it shine the way that I know it can. And really, you see that repeated across everything. I mean, there were tons of moments where I could feel all of the tweaks that were made, and you could tell they were done with a genuine desire to improve, but it's still just not enough for me to say this is the entry where Tecmo figured out Fatal Frame. Just like with Fatal Frame 1, I'm gonna say this is a must-play for survival horror fans, only this time with the confidence that none of you are gonna have to save scum to beat this one. So, you know, little miracles. Now, I'm not going to say this is the PS2's go-to survival horror title, but I will say it's got the potential to be. I mean, this franchise's entire design ethos, based on my experience with just these two titles, is a hair's breadth away from being incredible. I just want to see these guys execute on their ideas just a bit better. Now, I am once again going to be very optimistic and hope for the third entry in the franchise to finally deliver on the massive amount of hype I still have for it. But as of right now, I can confidently say this is a noticeable improvement on its predecessor and a fun, if not difficult time. It's an awesome little look and an alternative take on the genre, and there truly is some good survival horror style exploration, item hunting, and puzzle solving to do. But the glue that's holding all that stuff together is not as good as it could be. So I guess there you have it. Once again, it has taken me more than an hour to come to a non-conclusion in one of these videos. Here's hoping the next entry in the retrospective breaks this cycle, but in order to figure that out, I'm gonna have to get back to work. So here's hoping I see all of you again in the next one, but if I don't, thank you all so much for watching The Fatal Frame Retrospective. Hello, you absolute legends. Thanks a whole bunch for making it to the end card. I'm assuming you guys know the deal by now. This channel only really works because some of the people who watch it are kind enough to support it, allowing me the financial freedom to pursue the topics that I want and not the ones that get the most clicks. Now, if you want to join that group, I've got links down in the description, or you could just click the join button right by the video. If you're not making the kind of scratch that would allow for that, or you just don't want to, I very much understand, and I really do appreciate you just getting over here and spending some of your day with me. Hopefully it's not too much to ask for a like, comment, or subscription, but if it is, I'm sad to say this, but I don't think we could be friends. Well, that's all the self-promotion I can take for a day, so I guess I'll see you all next time. Peace out.